There's a place where the scent of cookies mingles with golden candlelight. A place people come not just for sweetness, but to remember something sacred. What it feels like to belong. On a snowy evening, Emily stood alone in her little bakery. The laughter had faded, the chairs were empty, but the warmth hadn't left. One final batch of cookies sat cooling by the window. And in that quiet, she knew they weren't just cookies. They were love, memory, magic. This isn't just a baking story. This is the perfect batch of cookies. And you're a part of it now. The rain had already begun its gentle song on the rooftop above before Emily opened her eyes. No wind, no thunder, just the rhythm of water greeting the earth. She stayed still for a moment, listening to the patter like a lullaby meant for morning instead of night. The soft gray light creeping in through the curtains let her know the sun had not yet shown its face. But today was special cookie day. Emily yawned, arms stretching above her head, toes reaching toward the foot of the bed as her body slowly welcomed the dawn. She loved these quiet starts, where nothing yet demanded her attention and the world felt kind. Pulling her feet from the covers, she slipped into her favorite woolen slippers well worn, with a tiny stitched heart on each toe end shuffled across the wooden floor. In her kitchen, the scent of yesterday's baking still lingered, faintly warm sugar, a touch of vanilla, and the comforting essence of her old pine wood shelves. She set a small kettle on the stove and filled her teacup with loose leaf winter blend cranberry, orange, and a hint of cinnamon bark. A breath later, steam danced through the air, carrying the spice with it. She closed her eyes and inhaled, smiling. This was her rhythm. She cradled the cup between her hands and walked toward the bay window. Her house, like her heart, was small but open. She looked out across Maple Street. Most windows were dark, the town still curled in sleep, except for one faint light glowing in the distance, like a quiet nod from a neighbor starting early. Emily had always loved mornings, not just because of the stillness, but because she felt like a secret keeper, watching the world stretch and wake. And on this day, the annual cookie decorating party at her bakery, she was more than the keeper. She was the host of magic. As the tea warmed her from within, her gaze drifted toward the sky. It was the kind of cloudy that promised snow. Not the harsh kind that bites your face, but the gentle kind that flurries like lace. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, whispered, "Just a bit colder," and chuckled softly to herself. Her bakery, the Honey Hearth, had stood on the corner of Maple and Birch for nearly a decade. But it felt older, like it had grown roots into the pavement, holding memories in its bricks and smells. People often told her it was like walking into a hug. She finished the last sip of her tea and washed the cup by hand, setting it gently on the drying rack made from bamboo. Then she wandered back into her bedroom and pulled open her wardrobe. Inside, on a wooden hanger, was her favorite holiday sweater. She wore it each year on Cookie Day. It was soft, cozy, and slightly ridiculous, with a patchwork snowman whose carrot nose always pointed slightly sideways. Children loved it. Adults smiled at it. Emily? She felt like a walking invitation to joy. Layered in her sweater, jeans, and thick socks, she wrapped herself in her burgundy coat and wrapped a scarf around her neck twice. A beanie with a pom-pom crowned her curly hair. Then she reached for her newest umbrella green with golden polka dots, its handle shaped like a duck's head, a gift from her customers after her old one broke. They had left it on her doorstep one morning, tied with a ribbon and a note. No baker should be caught in the rain. She smiled again at the memory as she stepped outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air crisp and filled with the smell of wet pavement and pine. She opened her umbrella and began her short walk to the bakery. The handle nestled comfortably in her palm. As she passed the brick houses lined along Maple Street, she noticed something unusual in one of the windows. There, nestled on a cushion, was a black cat she didn't recognize. But then, beside it, came a flicker of white. Her heart softened. It was Snowdrop, the neighborhood cat who often watched her walk by. Now it had company. "They've made a friend," Emily whispered, warmth blooming in her chest. She walked slowly, letting the rhythm of her boots and puddles accompany the soft whispers of drizzle above. Ahead, her bakery came into view, its hand-painted door a patchwork of soft blues, pinks, and greens. She'd painted it herself over several weekends, each color chosen by a child from the community. Sliding the key into the lock, Emily paused. She took one last look at the quiet morning around her and whispered, "Here we go," before stepping inside. The familiar aroma of roasted beans and burnt sugar greeted her like an old friend. She flicked on the lights, revealing the gentle glow of wood, copper, and ceramic. Then, kneeling by the wall, she plugged in the string of fairy lights that danced around the windows and over the tables like whispers of magic. Today, she wouldn't start with cinnamon rolls. Today was about cookie chocolate chip, sugar, and her favorite stained glass. She walked toward the pantry, heart light, hands ready, mind already decorating. Emily stood before the pantry with the quiet resolve of a woman about to begin something sacred. Shelves lined with glass jars, tins, and wooden boxes welcomed her like old friends. She ran her fingers along the labels. Flour, sugar, cinnamon, vanilla, everything was in its place. Everything had its purpose. Today's mission was simple: to create joy one batch at a time. First came the chocolate chip cookies, always a favorite. She gathered white sugar, brown sugar, flour, and a small bottle of Madagascar vanillate scent, instantly calming. From the refrigerator came the softened butter, eggs, and a small glass dish holding baking soda wrapped in wax paper, a habit she'd learned from her grandmother. For the finishing touch, she reached for her most indulgent ingredient, oversized dark chocolate chunks that melted into puddles of comfort. She mixed the dry and wet ingredients in separate bowls, humming a soft tune as she stirred. Then, with practiced hands, she brought them together, folding in the chocolate at the very end to keep each piece whole. As the dough came together thick and golden and speckled with promise, Emily smiled to herself. "This is where the magic starts," she whispered. She lined a tray with parchment and used an ice cream scoop to portion each mound, spacing them with care. Once filled, she slid the tray into the oven and leaned against the counter. The soft click of the timer gave her a few precious moments to breathe, and she used them well. With the chocolate chip batch baking, she turned to the more delicate Tasker stained glass sugar cookies. These weren't just sweets, they were stories made edible. Every year, the children marveled at their glowing centers. Emily marveled too, not at the color, but at the way something hard and ordinary like a candy could become art when given a little heat and heart. She pulled the chilled dough from the fridge yesterday's work. It was firm and cool in her hands, the perfect canvas. Rolling it out with care on her floured wooden table, she pressed cookie cutters into the dough, stars, trees, snowflakes, bells. Then, with smaller cutters, she carved out the centers, turning each shape into a window of possibility. She reached for the bag of brightly colored hard candies, separating them into tiny bowls by color: red like cranberries, green like pine, gold like sunlight through frost. Using her rolling pin, she crushed them into sparkling dust, the fragments catching the morning light like bits of stained glass. One by one, she filled each cookie's hollow with crushed candy, spooning it gently like she was placing precious stones into a mosaic. When the cookies were complete, she slid the trays into the oven and set another timer. The scent of chocolate had already begun to fill the bakery, a deep, sweet, earthy warmth that curled around the space like a hug. Emily walked over to the front door and cracked it open just slightly, letting in a touch of winter air. She closed her eyes and listened to the silence beyond the drizzle. Then, as if on cue, the door chime jingled behind her. She turned, and there stood her first guest of the day. It was Mr. Alfred Bennett, though everyone in town just called him Fred. He was in his 70s, a retired librarian with silver eyebrows and a matching mustache. He always wore the same wool coat and cap and carried a folded newspaper tucked under his arm like a treasured heirloom. "Morning, Emily," he said with a grin that crinkled his whole face. "Morning, Fred," she replied. "You're right on time. I wouldn't miss Cookie Day for anything," he said, stepping inside and rubbing his hands together. "Smells like you've outdone yourself this year." Emily chuckled and reached for a mug. She poured him a cup of dark roast, added a splash of cream just how he liked it, and slid it across the counter. "Chocolate chip just came out," she said, "and the stained glass are in the oven now." Fred lifted the mug to his lips and sighed in satisfaction. "You make mornings worth waking up for, Emily." As he wandered to his favorite seat by the window, Emily returned to the kitchen just in time for the timer. She pulled open the oven and was greeted by a wave of warmth and fragrance. The chocolate chip cookies were golden brown, the chocolate slightly molten but holding form. She placed the tray on the cooling rack and inhaled deeply. Then it was time to check on the stained glass cookies. When she opened the second oven, her breath caught in her chest. There they were perfect. The candy had melted into jeweled centers, glossy and translucent, the colors glowing like lanterns. She carefully removed the trays, setting them beside the chocolate chip batch. As the cookies cooled, Emily prepared a small platone of each kind for Fred. She placed it before him quietly, as she always did, and watched his reaction. Fred took one bite, his eyes widening. He chewed slowly, savoring. "Emily," he said, placing the cookie down gently, "I think you've done it. This may be your perfect batch." He said it every year, but somehow it always felt true. She smiled, heart swelling with a quiet pride. Cookie Day had begun. As the sweet scent of cookies filled the bakery and the fairy lights twinkled like sleepy stars above the windows, Emily took a slow breath and looked around her shop. Everything felt just right. The tables were polished, the decorations arranged, the warmth humming gently through every wooden beam. The bell above the door jingled again, this time with a more chaotic rhythm. Gwen Harper entered, balancing a baby bag over one shoulder and gently guiding her twin boys with the other hand. The toddlers Noah and Nathan waddled in with matching green socks that peeked out from beneath their rolled-up jeans. One wore a pair of plastic, blue-framed glasses. That was the only way anyone could tell them apart. "Emily," Gwen smiled, already breathless. "We made it." "You always do," Emily said, grinning. She leaned over the counter to wave at the boys. "Hi, Noah. Hi, Nathan." Both children waved back. though one got distracted by the peppermint jar on the counter. "I hope you still have sugar cookies," Gwen said, unzipping the boys' coats. "That's all they've talked about since breakfast." "I made extra just for them," Emily said. "The cookie corner's all set." The little ones dashed toward the children's nook by the window, where tiny chairs and a miniature table stood ready with coloring books, crayons, and a plastic jar labeled cookie crayons. They decorated it themselves last year, crayons, scribbles, and all. As Gwen followed after her boys, Emily returned to the kitchen and began setting up the first trays. Chocolate chip cookies, still warm and gooey, went on the silver stands. Sugar cookies, crisp and ready to decorate, were arranged like puzzle pieces waiting for color. And the stained glass batch those were given the place of honor in the middle of the largest table, glowing like edible jewels under the soft glow of fairy lights. The door opened again. This time it was Rose Thompson, her longtime friend and unofficial bakery helper. Rose was the kind of person who arrived early and stayed late, always wearing an apron she claimed had been handed down from her grandmother. Today it was covered in tiny holly leaves and embroidered with the words, "Sweet as sugar." "You didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Rose said, removing her scarf. "I was counting on you," Emily replied, already reaching for the kettle. The two women worked in rhythm without needing to speak, pouring tea, arranging icing tubes, setting up bowls of sprinkles in every color imaginable. Ruby red, silver stars, blue frost, lemon yellow, and sparkling green. They placed decorating sugar in little glass jars with cork lids, each with a handwritten label. The bakery was transforming, not just in look, but in energy. Emily could feel it. Each year, the cookie decorating party was more than just an event, it was a moment. A sacred pause in the rush of the season, a gathering of hearts and hands and laughter. For some, it was tradition. For others, a gentle surprise. For all, it was home. By 10 o'clock, more guests began to arrive. There was Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, the elderly couple visiting from out of town. They always stopped by when visiting their grandchildren, claiming no holiday was complete without Emily's cookies. There was Joy and Caleb, newlyweds still finding their way in town, and old Theo, who'd been coming since Emily opened her doors. He didn't decorate cookies, he just sat by the fire with his dog-eared book and smiled at everyone who passed. Emily greeted them all with warmth and a plate full of choice. "Choose any table," she said, "and don't be shy with the sprinkles." The room filled quickly. Soon, the bakery was abuzz with chatter and laughter, the occasional squeal from a toddler, the satisfying crack of peppermint sticks being broken into pieces. It was a soft chaos, the kind that only happens when people feel completely safe and welcome. Emily stood behind the counter for a moment, just observing. She saw Fred sharing a table with the Whitakers, passing the sugar bowl between them like it was a treasured heirloom. Gwen crouched beside her boys, guiding their hands as they squeezed icing onto snowflake cookies. Rose was helping Joy frost a bell-shaped treat, offering gentle tips with a knowing smile. And there, by the window, Theo sat peacefully, his eyes not on his book, but on the people around him. Emily felt something swell inside her chest, not pride exactly, and not just joy. It was something deeper, a quiet knowing that this was what she was made for. Creating a space where people could be soft, where they could belong. A flurry of movement caught her eye. Outside, snow had begun to fall. The first flakes were light, dancing gently in the air, like feathers from an unseen sky. A hush spread through the room as someone pointed toward the window. Conversations softened. Children pressed their hands to the glass. Even adults leaned in, watching as the world outside turned white. "It's snowing," Noah whispered, voice full of awe. Emily smiled and walked slowly to the door. She opened it quietly and stepped outside. As the wooden door swung open with a soft creak, a breath of winter greeted Emily's cheeks. The snow was falling in earnest, now quiet, slow, and steady. Each flake drifted like a whisper from heaven, settling gently on the ground, on the railing, on the shoulders of her burgundy coat. She stepped outside fully, letting the warmth of the bakery slip behind her and the cool embrace of the morning take its place. For a moment, she just stood there, arms slightly outstretched, eyes lifted to the sky. Snowflakes kissed her nose, her lashes, her hair. She twirled once, slowly, the way she hadn't since she was a girl in her mother's backyard, catching flakes on her tongue and pretending the whole world had gone quiet just for her. And just like that, it had. Even the streets seemed to hush beneath the snow. No cars, no footsteps, just the gentle hush of the world exhaling. Across the street, rooftops wore soft white blankets, and the edges of lampposts gleamed with new dustings. Emily took it all in. From inside, through the bakery's windows, she could see people still watching. Children had their faces pressed against the glass. Some waved at her, wide-eyed with wonder. She waved back, cheeks rosy. In that instant, she felt something ancient and quiet settle inside her, like the world had slowed down just enough for her to remember something she didn't know she'd forgotten. A crow waddled across the street, leaving a trail of tiny footprints in the snow. It turned its head toward her, as if acknowledging her presence, then flapped off into the gray sky, vanishing behind a rooftop. Emily glanced down at her own boots, and the imprint they left deep, sure, and perfect. A quiet smile touched her lips. Every footprint meant you'd been somewhere worth walking. With one last glance upward, she whispered, "Thank you," and turned to head back inside. Warmth embraced her instantly. The heat from the ovens, the glow of the fairy lights, and the low hum of voices all wrapped around her like a familiar song. As she closed the door behind her, the scent of baked sugar and melted chocolate seemed even sweeter. "Was it cold?" Rose asked from the counter, placing a tray of undecorated stars onto the center table. "Just cold enough to make the snow feel magical," Emily replied, removing her coat and shaking out the snowflakes. Fred glanced up from his newspaper. "It's the kind of snow that sticks to your coat but not your troubles." Emily laughed softly. "Exactly." She returned to her station and wiped her hands before gathering a few more items from the pantry. The decorating tables were nearly full now. Platters of cookies in all shape stars, snowmen, bells, mittens, pine trees waited like blank canvases. At each table sat bowls of toppings, peppermint pieces, coconut shreds, rainbow sprinkles, and crushed hazelnuts. Icing tubes in every color spilled across the center like a watercolor palette come to life. Some cookies had already begun to take shape. A toddler had decorated a snowman with crooked jelly bean buttons and a mustache made of licorice. Gwen had frosted an evergreen tree with green icing so thick it looked like it belonged in a fantasy forest. Fred was meticulously dotting a bell with golden sugar pearls. But most people weren't concerned with perfection. They laughed. They shared stories. They leaned in close to help one another. That was the real recipe Emily had always followed: 1 part sweetness, two-part soul. At the far table, the metal cookie tree was beginning to bloom. Each branch had a little hook, and more guests were choosing to leave behind one of their decorated cookies as a gift to the bakery. There were cookies with initials written in gel, snowflakes outlined in blue, even one star-shaped cookie with hope piped in red across the middle. Emily paused before it, marveling at the way the sugar glinted like frost in the lights. She could feel the meaning behind each one. This wasn't just cookie day. This was memory making. This was healing. She returned to the kitchen and began arranging new trays of sugar cookies onto fresh platters. Some she left plain for guests to decorate. Others, she carefully iced herself for white with delicate silver dots or pale blue with graceful snow lines. She always made a few just the way her mother used to classic stars with yellow icing and cinnamon sugar. Emily picked one of those up and held it for a moment before taking a bite. The crunch was perfect, the flavor warm and nostalgic. She closed her eyes. Some flavors didn't just fill your mouth, they filled your heart. Just then, the front door opened once more. It was someone she didn't recognize, a young couple, hesitating in the doorway. The man held a wrapped box in his hands. The woman, wide-eyed and hopeful, gave a nervous smile. "Hi," she said. "We just moved here. We saw the sign for the cookie party." Emily walked toward them, arms open like a welcome mat. "You're right on time," she said. "Come on in. There's always room for more at this table." The young couple stepped inside slowly, as if not yet certain they were allowed to belong. Emily gave them her warmest smile, the kind that didn't just say, "Welcome," but whispered, "You're safe here." "I'm Emily," she said, extending her hand. "This is the Honey Hearth, and today it's your bakery too." The woman's shoulders relaxed. She introduced herself as Rachel and her husband, James. They had just moved into the little blue house 2 blocks away. The wrap box in James's hands contained homemade ginger cookies and offering, not for show, but from the heart. Emily's eyes lit up. "We'll make room on the cookie tree," she said. With that, the last of their hesitance melted. Emily led them to a cozy table by the window where Rose had just poured 2 mugs of cinnamon spice cider. A few chairs shifted, someone made space, and just like that, they were part of it, woven into the soft, golden fabric of the morning. Rachel looked around in awe. "I don't think I've ever seen something like this." Emily chuckled, brushing a dusting of flour off her apron. "Most people haven't." It started as a way to bring joy to a handful of kids one snowy December, and then it just kept growing. On the far side of the room, the cookie decorating had reached new creative heights. One child was carefully crafting an entire nativity scene in cookies, while another had frosted a snowman wearing sunglasses and holding a surfboard. The Whitakers were gently piping their initials onto a bell-shaped cookie with the focus of calligraphers. At the center of it all, the metal cookie tree stood tall its silver limbs, filling steadily with edible ornaments. There were cookies shaped like mittens and stars, others with poems piped in icing, and one particularly intricate angel with licorice wings and sugar crystal halo. Emily took a breath, letting it all in. This wasn't just a party, it was a portrait of belonging. She returned to the counter and began preparing a second batch of sugar cookies. As she worked, she found herself thinking of her mother again, the woman who had taught her to bake by memory, not by measurement. Every family recipe came with a story. "The dough will tell you when it's ready," her mother used to say. Hands deep in flour, eyes soft with knowing. And it was true. The dough always told the truth. As Emily kneaded, she glanced around. People she loved filled every corner of the bakery. Fred by the fireplace, the twins darting beneath tables, Rose arranging new decorations on the counter, Theo nodding quietly as he read the same paragraph of his novel for the third time. And now, James and Rachel knew roots being planted. For a moment, Emily paused and closed her eyes. She didn't need to speak. Gratitude, she had learned, could be quiet. Then came a tiny tug on her apron. Emily looked down to see Nathan, one of the twins, holding up a sugar cookie with an uncertain look on his face. It was vaguely shaped like a reindeer, though it had one green eye and a single purple sprinkle antler. "Is it okay?" he asked softly. Emily knelt beside him, eye level with his tiny creation. "It's perfect," she said, gently taking the cookie and holding it up toward the lights. "This reindeer has seen things, and I think he's ready for the cookie tree." Nathan giggled, and together they walked across the bakery and hung the cookie on the lowest branch. A few other children followed, eager to add their own cookies. In minutes, the tree had gained 5 more ornaments, each one bursting with sugar and pride. From the speakers tucked near the windows, soft music began to play. A piano rendition of an old holiday waltz filled the air like snowfall turned sound. Conversation softened. For a brief stretch of time, no one moved too quickly. Emily returned to the kitchen and poured herself a cup of tea. Not the cranberry orange blend from earlier, but chamomile, this time soft, floral, forgiving. She carried it to her window seat, where she sat with her knees tucked up and watched as the outside world became paler with every passing minute. Snow blanketed the streets. Cars slowed. The branches of bare trees now carried delicate lacework woven from sky. Inside, though, it was still warm, still glowing. Rachel walked over and sat beside her. "I didn't expect this," she said, watching the children laugh. "It's like we walked into something sacred." Emily turned to her and nodded. "That's exactly what it is." Rachel smiled, a touch of emotion catching in her eyes. "My mom used to bake with me," she whispered. "When she passed, I stopped. It was just too hard. But today," she trailed off, voice thick with memory. Emily placed a hand over hers. "Today," she said gently, "you remembered something you hadn't forgotten. That's what this place is for." The moment stretched between them like a still lake quiet, full of reflection and deeper than it seemed. And just as Rachel wiped a tear from her cheek, a small voice called from across the room, "Look, the snow's glowing." All eyes turned to the window, where the afternoon light, softened by clouds and snow, glowed against the glass with a soft pink hue. It bathed the bakery in warmth, like the world had paused to let the light in. Emily smiled. So did everyone else. The cookies were still baking, but the hearts, they were already full. The oven clicked softly as it preheated, the orange coil inside glowing like a quiet sunrise. Emily stood before it with a tray in her hand, her final batch of the day. She had saved it on purpose, for this moment when the bakery had reached its calmest hum, when the light outside had turned to amber, and every heart inside was full yet still hungry for something warm. She pressed her palm gently against the side of the oven door, feeling the heat through the metal. "These are the ones that matter most," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but maybe to the spirit of the place itself. The dough was shaped simply: circles, stars, and hearts. But what made these cookies special wasn't their form. It was what she folded into them: memories, not recipes, not technique, but feeling. One star held the memory of her father's laughter as he danced with her mother in the kitchen, powdered sugar snowing from the countertop. Another circle held the silence of her first Christmas alone, when she learned how grief could sit beside gratitude without ruining it. And the heart, always her favorite, held too many stories to name first friendships, last goodbyes, new beginnings. She slid the tray into the oven and set the timer. Then she exhaled. Behind her, the bakery had grown quiet again, not silent but gentle, the kind of quiet that only happens after a long day well spent. Conversations had become soft. Most guests were seated, sipping cider or cocoa, admiring the cookie tree that now shimmered with dozens of edible ornaments. Fred sat by the fire, eyes closed, not asleep, just still. Gwen had taken one twin onto her lap, the other resting against her shoulder. James was talking with Theo, laughter low and deep between them. And Rachel was decorating a single cookie with delicate lines of white icing, her hand steady, her smile soft and knowing. Emily leaned against the doorway to the kitchen and took it all in. This is what her mother would have called a sacred hour. The time when everything had already been given, and what remained was the glow that giving leaves behind. The timer beeped, a small and steady sound. She turned, slipped on her mitts, and opened the oven. The scent was immediate, caramelizing sugar, warm vanilla, butter folded into golden crispness. She breathed it in and smiled. The cookies had risen just right, their edges barely browned, their centers soft and glowing. She lifted the tray and set it on the rack to cool. Then, almost ceremonially, she selected 3 cookies sewn of each shape and placed them on a small porcelain plate with blue flowers around the rim. It had been her grandmother's, brought out only once a year. With the plate in hand, she stepped into the main room. The room quieted slightly as she approached the tree, not because she asked, but because they sensed the shift in the moment. Emily held up the plate. "These are the last of today's batch," she said, voice steady but low, "and I'd like to share them." She looked around, pausing at each familiar face. "Not because they're the best cookies I've made today, but because they carry pieces of stories, and maybe they'll remind you of one of yours." She broke the star in half and handed one piece to Rachel, who blinked back emotion as she accepted it. The circle she offered to Fred, who took it with a wink, and the heart she kept for herself. Together, the 3 of them took a bite, and the taste was something beyond flavor. It was memory. It was warmth. It was the quiet magic of a moment held and honored. Emily returned to the counter and began packing small bags of cookies for guests to take home, each bag tied with string and a tiny handwritten tag that read, "Thank you for being part of the warmth." Children lined up with bright eyes, some proudly holding the cookies they'd chosen not to eat, but to display on their own trees at home. Parents exchanged knowing glances, the kind that silently said, "This will be a memory they'll carry." Even Rose, ever the helper, paused long enough to sip a warm cider and whisper, "This might be the best one yet." Emily smiled. She heard that every year. And every year, it was true. The sky outside had darkened now, and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world beyond the windows. The bakery was aglow with lights, laughter, and the slow, steady closing of a beautiful day. Emily wiped her hands on her apron one last time, then placed the final tray of cookies on the counter. Not for sale, not for decoration. just for sharing, one guest at a time. The bells above the door jingled gently as the first of the guests began to slip on coats, wrap scarves around their necks, and button up their memories alongside their jackets. Outside, the snowfall had thickened. Street lamps spilled golden halos onto the sidewalks, now hidden beneath powdery white. The world looked softer somehow, as though someone had dimmed the harshness and turned up the wonder. Inside, Emily moved slowly, lovingly, through the bakery, offering small brown bags tied with ribbon to each departing guest. Each bag contained 2 cookies, one they'd made and one she'd chosen for them. "Something sweet you created," she said with a smile, "and something sweet that found you." The twins received their bags with sleepy delight, cradling them like treasure chests. Gwen lifted them gently into her arms, whispering thanks to Emily with tired but grateful eyes. "You gave us more than cookies today," she said. "You gave us a memory I know they'll carry." Emily touched her arm. "That's all I ever hoped to do." Fred, ever the last to leave, stood near the fireplace, holding his cookie bag like it was a letter from an old friend. "It's always hard to leave a place that reminds you who you are," he said. Emily tilted her head. "You can always come back." He nodded slowly. "That's the beauty, isn't it? A good place always waits for you." Rose helped clean the final crumbs from the tables, her movements slow and unhurried. Emily watched as she packed the last few leftover cookies into tins marked for the shelter and the library. They always gave away what was left. Cookies weren't meant to be hoarded, they were meant to be shared. James and Rachel were the last to approach the counter, cheeks pink from cider and laughter, hands entwined. "We brought cookies," Rachel said softly, "but we're leaving with something better." Emily smiled, slipping one last bag across the counter. "You're leaving with pieces of us, and we're keeping pieces of you." Rachel blinked fast. "Next year, we'd love to help you bake." Emily's heart lifted. "I'd love that too." As they left, hand in hand, a gust of cold air swept into the bakery. Emily stood in the doorway, watching as their footprints disappeared into the snow behind them. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening not to sound, but to the feeling that remained in the air. It was not silence. It was reverence. She closed the door gently, the final chime of the bell sounding like a soft exhale. Then she turned back toward the now empty bakery. Only candlelight remained glowing on the tables. The cookie tree stood tall in the corner, branches full of cookies that would remain until the new year, each one holding a story, a smile, a touch of someone's time. Emily walked toward it and selected one ornamented cookie to remove, not to eat, but to carry with her. A star, thick with white icing and golden sugar. She tied a new string through its top and slipped it gently into her pocket. Not all gifts need to be unwrapped. She returned to the counter, poured the final cup of tea for herself, and sat down on the stool where she'd begun the day. And she thought, not about what needed cleaning or what supplies she'd need next week, but about hands that had iced cookies, held mugs, carried children, waved across rooms, folded in prayer. Hands that reached out and touched others with warmth they may never fully understand. She took a sip of tea. It was no longer hot, but somehow it was still comforting. Outside, the snow danced under the light. Inside, her heart did the same. She rose slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. Across the street, the window of the little blue house was now lit with a soft glow. Inside, She could see Rachel placing cookies on a plate and James lighting a candle, the new light of a tradition just beginning. Emily touched the window glass with her palm, the cold seeping into her skin, and she smiled. She had always believed in small things, small shops, small gestures, small cookies. But today reminded her of a great truth, that small things, when shared in love, become grand. And Cookie Day? Cookie Day was never just about cookies. It was about being seen, being remembered, being home. The bakery was quiet now. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty, but the kind that arrives after a song has been sung when the last note hangs in the air, reverberating with beauty. Emily stood in the center of her shop, the lights dimmed, the oven off, her apron dusted with flour and memories. The cookie tree sparkled faintly in the corner, its branches adorned with handmade ornaments too sweet to last, yet destined to be remembered. She moved slowly through the space, her fingers brushing against tabletops, chairs, the counter's edge, each one echoing laughter, whispers, and the soft murmur of lives intersecting for a moment. A trace of cinnamon still lingered in the air. So did something else. Love. It was the kind that didn't need to be said aloud. It had already been spoken in the frosting of a crooked snowflake, the warm mug passed across a table, the quiet nod between strangers who no longer felt like strangers. Emily returned to the kitchen, where one last cookie remained. It sat alone on a plate heart-shaped, golden, dusted with powdered sugar. She picked it up gently and carried it to her favorite chair by the window. Outside, the snow fell like ash from heaven, slow and rhythmic. The world was wrapped in silence. Inside, only the soft crackle of the fireplace and the hum of her breath remained. She looked down at the cookie, then out the window, and she whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to everyone. To the twins who squealed over rainbow sprinkles. To Fred, who always remembered the good things. To Rose, who never left her side. To James and Rachel, who walked in shy but left woven into the story. And to her mother, whose recipes had no measurements, only memory. She took a bite of the cookie. It melted on her tongue, sweet, warm, full of butter and something else. Something old, something eternal. It tasted like every winter that ever mattered. Like every time someone came in from the cold and was met with a smile. Emily stood once more and walked to the front of the shop. She reached into a drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a small candle in a glass jar. It was the last of its kind lavender honey, her favorite. She lit it with a match and set it on the sill. The soft glow painted the room in gold, a single flickering reminder that the light didn't leave just because the people had. She stood there for a while, watching the flame dance. In the reflection of the window, she saw not just herself, but the echo of everyone who had been there that day. Their laughter, their hands, their stories, and behind them, the snow. The world outside would forget this day, but the people inside wouldn't. They would carry it in their hands, in their homes, in their hearts. She turned the sign on the door from open to closed, but left the candle burning. And as she locked up, she didn't feel like she was ending something. She felt like she was tending something sacred. The bakery didn't need to be full to hold love. It had always been a place of quiet magic, a hearth, a home. And on this night, under a sky blanketed in snow, with nothing but the hum of the world turning slowly outside her window, Emily knew this had been the perfect batch. Not because the cookies were flawless, but because the day had risen and fallen in love. And now the lights are dim, the cookie tins are empty, and the snow continues to fall softly outside. But the warmth of this day, the laughter, the quiet glances, the shared sweetness, they don't disappear. They stay in your hands, in your heart, like a perfect cookie, still warm from the oven. If this story brought you comfort, leave a little love in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe, because here, every story is baked with heart. Until next time, sleep well, dream sweetly, and remember, sometimes the smallest things are the most sacred.